Good afternoon. Uh, Welcome. I'm Deepak Thapa of the Social Science Baha. Perhaps some of you are not aware, but this afternoon's lecture actually kicks off a 3-day conference called Changing Dynamics of Nepali Society and Politics that the Social Science Baha is organizing along with the Alliance for Social Dialogue and the Association for Nepal and Himalayan Studies. And it is on behalf of all three organizations that I welcome you this afternoon. I will keep my remarks short because I'm sure you came here to listen to Professor Fisher. However, I cannot help but draw parallels between what is happening today and another conference the Social Science Baha had hosted back in April 2003. The Agenda of Transformation Inclusion in Nepali Democracy was the conference, and just as today, we had opened the conference with the Mahesh Chandra Regmi lecture, the inaugural one, which had been delivered by the late Dr. Harka Gurung. This lecture itself was instituted with the consent of Mahesh Chandra Regmi himself, and although he had shied away from public life for years, partly as a result of his frail health, at our fervent request, he had been present on the first lecture given in his name. The picture you see behind me on the banner shows him on that occasion. I believe he thought the event to be of some significance, for that day he chose to don the same shirt he had worn to receive the Raman Magsaysay Award in 1977. You'll see the picture printed in the lecture that will be handed out to you as you leave the hall at the end. It was indeed a sad day for Nepali scholarship when Mahesh Chandra Regmi passed away just 2 months later. As for the conference Inclusion in Nepali Democracy, when it was held, the concept of inclusion was yet a long way from becoming part of the national lexicon. And we at the Baha would like to believe that we played a small, though I would venture to add, not an insignificant part in popularizing the idea in Nepal. We believe that the conference beginning today is an apt follow-up to the one held in 2003, since as a country, we were then still in the phase of identifying the myriad problems ailing Nepal, particularly the social dislocations that were gradually becoming evident, with the Maoist insurgency providing the backdrop to it all, even though at the particular time of the conference a ceasefire was on. As a country, we have traversed a great distance in the intervening 8 years, and it is perhaps time to examine what has changed, not only since then, but also go further back to the beginning of the reinstatement of the democratic era, albeit interrupted some 2 decades ago. We've been very fortunate to have received the financial assistance of the Open Society Foundations New York and the Embassy of Switzerland here in Kathmandu. Without their support, it would not have been possible to host an event of this scale, and we'd like to acknowledge their contribution in making it possible to bring so many scholars from around the world here today to deliberate on and perhaps make some sense of the transformations Nepal is currently undergoing. I also want to thank the Alliance for Social Dialogue and the Association for Nepal and Himalayan Studies for joining hands with us in putting this conference together. About the Alliance for Social Dialogue, there will be occasions in the next few days to hear more about it. But now I want to invite Professor David Holmberg, a longtime member of the Association for Nepal and Himalayan Studies, or ANHS in short, to say a few words about it and the conference as well. David?
Namaste. Deepak asked me to say a few words about the Association for Nepal and Himalayan Studies. Although I've been a long-time member of this group and edited what was once the newsletter of that association, it is really our main speaker today, Professor James Fisher, who was one of the founding fathers of this organization. The ANHS, it's an international organization of both scholars and scholarly institutions focused on research and scholarly work in the greater Himalaya, Karakoram, Hindu Kush kind of zone of high altitude Asia. The ANHS, the Association for Nepal and Himalayan Studies, grew out of a prior organization, which is called the Nepal Studies Association, that was first formed in 1971, and then it was in 1999 that they broadened the scope of the organization to include the greater Himalayan region. The core membership, however, remains scholars who work in Nepal and, excuse me, primarily North American scholars, although there are several international members. There's some 13 major universities now who hold institutional memberships in the ANHS. It has been, however, in the last few years and in the last decade that the association has made real advances under a very energetic and competent new generation of scholars, including Mahendra Lohati, one of the co-organizers of this event, Arjun Gunaratne, and the current president, Jeff Childs. The ANHS has also begun a collaboration with the social science Baha here in Kathmandu, and there is now a Kathmandu Research Center of the Association of Nepal and Himalayan Studies, a center that is here to support scholars and students conducting research in Nepal. The ANHS has a main publication. It's called Himalaya, which has turned into a true academic journal. And as I understand it from Deepak Ji, this is now available in Kathmandu. It evolved out of what had just been a newsletter into something that's really quite substantial in terms of its scholarly contributions. Among other things, the publications and the organization of conferences and the like, the ANHS also provides some monetary support to scholars. They have a senior research fellowship, which is awarded on an annual basis. They also have a prize for the best student paper in Himalayan studies called the Dor Bahadur Bista Prize. The ANHS also provides support, particularly to Nepali scholars, to travel to international conferences. This association meets on an annual basis, usually at another meeting, a South Asia meeting that's held in Madison, Wisconsin. But this fall, for the very first time that I'm aware of, the association is holding a separate conference focused entirely on the Himalayas. It is entitled Rethinking the Himalaya, the Indo-Tibetan Interface and Beyond, and this will be held in October in Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. If you want to know more about the organization and what it does, or take advantage of some, submit a paper, those of you who are students here for the prize, there's a website. Just Google, Association for Nepal and Himalayan Studies, and you will find also more information about the association, but also about this specific conference. Now, I don't want to go on too long here. The other thing Deepak asked me to mention a bit was this conference that Professor Fisher is going to give the kind of inaugural address in. And this actually, Mahendra Lohati and I began talking about this quite a while ago, and the idea was to try to put together papers that were engaging different domains of this sort of state of knowledge in particular domains. It is kind of transformed into a broader kind of theme of change, and most of the papers deal in one form or another with change and the contemporary circumstances of Nepal. We hope in particular that many of these papers will be we will be able to organize into volumes and publish in the not too distant future. And on that note, I think I will turn this over to, again, to whoever it is that's going to introduce Professor Fisher.
Thank you, David. With apologies, I would like to beg the indulgence of this gathering as we conduct a brief ceremony that is specific to the social science Baha, and that we'd like to undertake with the consent of our fellow organizers. Many of you here today know that the social science Baha was the beneficiary of a generous grant of 5 million rupees, or it sounds much better when we say 50 lakhs, from Mr. Bihari Krishna Shrestha to set up an academic fellowship. Without dwelling too much on the fact, there is no denying that Mr. Shrestha's action was exemplary of what one might call academic philanthropy in Nepal in the finest sense of the term. Although he was initially quite reluctant that it should carry his name, he prevailed and he consented to its being called the Bihari Krishna Fellowship for Ethnographic Research. It just so happens that the Bihari Krishna Fellow, the first Bihari Krishna Fellow, has been selected and formally starts her fellowship tomorrow. And we wanted to take this opportunity to recognize the first fellow in your presence. With apologies again, I would now like to call upon Mr. Shrestha to come to the stage, and the first Bihari Krishna Fellow for Ethnographic Research, Shrestha Basnet, to join him to receive a citation that recognizes her as that. Mr. Shrestha and Shrestha. That basically says the first, what does it say? The Bihari Krishna Fellow for Ethnographic Research 2011, Shrestha Basnet. Now a few words from Mr. Shrestha.
I have been allowed only two sabda. So my first sabda goes to Shrestha herself. I would like to welcome her as the first Bihari Krishna Fellow for Ethnographic Studies. And Shrestha ji comes with a very impeccable CV and a great career already. Although as young as she is, she already has had a great career. So from her, after a year and some months, we can look forward to a document, a work that is more or less equivalent to what she herself calls Sheti Charitamanas, in line with Ram Charitamanas. Therefore, I wish her a great success in her endeavor. And at the same time, I will also use another sabda to thank Social Science Baha, who has taken upon itself to run this fellowship and then manage it. And it was only a few months ago that I handed over my donation to the Baha in this very hall. Now, within a few months, the Baha has been able to bring the fellowship over to this stage, where we already have the first fellow under this program. Therefore, I would very much like to thank Social Science Baha, particularly Mr. Deepak Thapa, and also the Academic Council that has been supervising or steering this program. Therefore, I very much look forward to continuing this cooperation with Social Baha, and I would like to thank them very much. Thank you.
Now I request Shrestha to say something even briefer.
Good afternoon. It is an honor to be speaking here today. I'm here to thank Mr. Bihari Krishna Shrestha for his generosity and this opportunity, Dr. Rajendra Pradhan for supervising my research, to Social Science Baha and Nepal School for giving me a physical as well as intellectual space. I have barely started my research project, so I have nothing much to say, except that the broad theme that I'm looking at is construction of good society. I'll be using oral narratives I'm learning Tamang language, watching lots of Tamang movies, and listening to lots of Tamang songs right now. I hope that I will have a lot more to say at the end of this research project, and I look forward to the day when Mr. Bihari Krishna Srestha and Dr. Rajendra Pradhan will thank me for the work I produce. Thank you so much.
Thank you to you both. We now move towards the lecture. Before we begin, I'd like to ask my associate Nachong to offer a khada to Professor Fisher. Introducing the speaker today, to introduce the speaker today, I call upon Dr. Rajendra Pradhan, who is the former chair of the Social Science Baha, in fact its founding chair, but who is currently now the Dean of the Nepal School of Social Sciences and Humanities.
Thank you. I think before I begin, can I request all of you to kindly switch off mobile phone or put it on silent mode? I think we have a jammer, but sometimes it doesn't work. And my request is that we respect the right of all of us to listen undisturbed to the speaker today. And it's also, I think, the first principle of democracy is respecting others' rights more than own rights. So let me begin by saying namaste, good afternoon. And again, on behalf of Social Science Baha, the Alliance for Social Dialogue, and Association for Nepal and Himalayan Studies, I'd like to welcome you to today's lecture. Again, I'm just repeating. And I would like to extend a very hearty welcome to Professor James Fisher, who will deliver today's lecture, which is titled, in case you have forgotten, Globalization in Nepal, Theory and Practice. Thank you, Professor, for accepting our invitation to deliver today's lecture. Now, since this part of the program is focused on the lecture itself, let me go on to talk a lot more about the Mahesh Chandra Regmi lecture, which, as Deepak said, was instituted by the Baha to honor what we believe is Nepal's foremost and finest scholar. Regmi's research and prolific publications on Nepal's political economic history have inspired many scholars, Nepalese and foreigners, and perhaps more foreign scholars than Nepali scholars, many of which do not or have not read Regmi-ji. But we believe that Regmi's publications are essential readings for anyone who wants to understand Nepal, the past as well as the current situation. Just think of the processes of Parvatiya Hinduization that were instituted in Nepal much before Jangabhadra Rana's rule came in 1954, which everybody cites. But they did not go beyond and use Regmi's documents to look beyond or further than 1854 and look at the demands being made by the Adivasi Janjati groups for control over Jal, Jamin, Jungle in the traditional homelands. All this you can find in the rich corpus of documents and writing by Regmi. Now, all this somehow seems to be forgotten out there. And I think that without understanding the past, understanding the past and the documents, it's very difficult to understand Nepal's present history. There is, in fact, a lot we still can learn. We still can learn from Regmi's publication and the documents he collected which are now, I believe, stored in Tribhuvan University at the Central Library, which I think perhaps nobody is using now. The first Mahesh Chandra Regmi lecture, as Deepak mentioned, was delivered by the late Harkabada Gurung in 2003 as the keynote address. And Regmiji was present in his wheelchair despite his illness. That was his last public appearance. The lecture continues to be called Mahesh Chandra Regmi Lecture and not Memorial Lecture, because we believe that he's still with us in his publications, which continue, or rather should continue, to inspire scholars on Nepal, despite post-structuralism, postmodernism, and other post-ism fads that come and go. So I think that his work is solid, and all these post-isms come and go, I think, and somehow we are missing the core, I think, of all these studies of Nepal history. 7 distinguished scholars have delivered the Mahesh Chandra Regmi lecture after Hatka Gurung, one each year. The historian Kumar Pradhan in 2004, the anthropologist Yera Tofa and Michael Opitz in 2005 and 6, the political scientist Ashish Nandi in 2007, the historians David Ludden and Romila Thapar in 8 and 9, and last year we had the political scientist and Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom. Today's lecture is the 9th in the series. It is also, as Deepak mentioned, the keynote address of the conference. These annual Regmi lectures testify to both the deep respect that eminent scholars have for Regmi scholarship, as well as, and not to be immodest about it, Baha's own reputation as Nepal's finest institution for scholarly activities. Indeed, the Regmi lecture series is arguably the most reputed scholarly event in Nepal's annual calendar. This is thanks, of course, to the scholars, but also thanks a great deal to all of you who attend the lectures. We have often been asked, what is the chief guest? Why don't you invite chief guests or special guests for our functions? The answer is simple. For us, the people who attend the lectures or functions, that is you, as well as the invited guests, are the invited speakers are the chief guests, and not some minister or some movie star or beauty queen of the world. And for today's function, our additional chief guest is obviously Mahesh Chandra Regmi, whose portrait occupies a special place in his dais. This is why we don't have chief guests and big round badges and other things like that. Now, let me briefly introduce today's speaker. James Fisher was professor of anthropology and sociology and Asian studies at Carleton College in the USA, where he taught for 38 years. In addition to introductory courses, excuse me, Professor Fisher taught on South Asia, anthropological theory, and biography and ethnography. While still a professor at Carleton College, he spent 2 years in Nepal as a Fulbright professor and helped start the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Tribhuvan University. This was about 25 years ago, and I think many of his colleagues and students are here today. After retiring from the college in 2009, he was also involved in starting a new college in Bhutan, where he served as the chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology for 1 year. Professor Fisher has now retired from his official duties, but as his lecture proves, he is still active intellectually. Professor Fisher's research interests lie in South Asia, especially Nepal, where he has done fieldwork on and off for the past 50 years. He first visited Nepal in 1962 And then in 1964, he accompanied Sir Edmund Hillary to set up educational institutions for the Sherpas. And I just heard that one of his first students of the institution is here. His first major field work was on the economies and ecology among the Magas of Dolpa in 1968-69. He then turned his attention to the Sherpas. So he worked on the Magas in Dolpa and then Sherpas later on. His research with them was on education and tourism in the 1970s and 80s. Finally, he conducted a person-centered ethnography on Tonka Prasad Acharya. This was in the late 80s and early 90s, who, as you know, was the Prime Minister of Nepal in 1995. These researches resulted in publication of 3 major books: Trans-Himalayan Traders, Economy, Society and Culture in Northwest Nepal, 68, this was in 86. Sherpa's Reflections on Change in Himalayan Nepal, 1999. Living Martyrs, Individuals and Revolution in Nepal, 1997, which also published in Nepali as Jiउँदो शहीदहरू. His publications also include Introductory Nepali, this was in 1965, and the edited book Himalayan Anthropology, Indo-Tibetan Interface. In fact, this was the first book that I saw of in about 1979. In today's lecture, you'll use materials from his 3 major research areas and themes to reflect on globalization and the changing dynamics of Nepali society and politics over the past 50 years. Having had the chance to read the lecture, I'm convinced that Professor Fisher is an excellent teacher, not to mention researcher. The lecture is extremely well written, effortlessly interweaving theories, themes, and ethnographic material, such that even someone who is not familiar with anthropology can easily understand the arguments you'll be making. I'm sure that you'll enjoy listening to this lecture as much as I look forward to hearing it. And I'll not say any more about the lecture because I think it's very, very clear. As is the custom in this lecture series, we will not have any question and answer sessions after the lecture. However, you are welcome to meet Professor Fisher during high tea to discuss questions you may have. And also, as Deepak mentioned, you're welcome to collect your copy of the lecture, of his lecture, on the way out after this program is over. I would now like to invite Professor Fisher to deliver his lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajendra Ji, for that very generous introduction, and to the audience for your welcome. Yo Mahapapurna lecture series ma malai nimto dino bayakoma ma social science bahalai danyabad dina chahanchu. Mahesh Chandra Regmi ko samjanama organized garye ko hunale yo lecture ko mahatva bare ko ho. Ami sabalai tahachaki Mahesh Chandra Regmi ko Nepal ko artik ityasma Tulo Yogadan Cha. Now at this point, I ask the indulgence of the audience if I may switch languages. The reason being that if I try to continue to give this lecture in Nepali, I'll be in very, very difficult straits. I'll be way over my head in very deep water. And if I drown, that won't do you any good or me any good. So bear with me while I try to do this in English. But let me continue by saying that it is also a great personal honor to follow in the footsteps of the many distinguished scholars who have delivered the Regmi lecture before me, especially my friend, mentor, and personal hero, Harka. This is as good a place as any to say that my entire intellectual development and career have been informed and immeasurably enhanced by my association over the decades with truly exceptional Nepali scholars, both within and outside the academy. I cannot imagine what it would have been without them. Whatever modest contribution I've been able to make over the years has been due to the influence of remarkable writers, thinkers, and friends, such as, in addition to Harka Gurung, Dor Bahadur Bista, writers, thinkers, and friends such as, in addition to Harka Gurung, Dor Bahadur Bista, Rishikesh Shah, Meena Acharya, and Bihari Krishna Shrestha. And I do not forget my extraordinary colleagues at the university, such as Chaitanya Misra, founder of the department there, and Krishna Bhattachan, both of whom are here today. And there are many others. You know who you are, and that you are too many to mention. Now then, for my remarks this afternoon. This lecture does double duty, since it also serves as the keynote address for the conference on changing dynamics of Nepali society and politics, which is an ambitious topic indeed. Those of you participating in the conference can choose to address whatever part of that mouthful of words you choose. Somehow I take it that I should cover all of it. But if a single word can be used to summarize the experience of Nepal in the first decade of the 21st century, that word is surely change. But the conference topic is not just change or dynamics, but doubling the ontological question and quadrupling its complexity, changing dynamics, which I take to be not only change or dynamics themselves, but the meta question of how change itself is changing. And not just Nepali society, which I feel marginally comfortable discussing, but also Nepali politics, a topic which represents much more precarious and treacherous ground. In any case, I certainly have noticed no lack of change in Nepal since I first came here almost 50 years ago in 1962, when there were virtually no hotels or restaurants in Kathmandu, and rarely was a car seen on the streets of the nation's capital. Sometimes I'm asked, what is the biggest change I've seen in all this time? I like that question because it's so easy to answer. The biggest change I've noticed, especially when I'm off trekking in the remote and difficult and steep terrain of Dolpa, as I was doing this year, is that I'm no longer 22 years old. This raises the important point that the anthropologist, far from being a disembodied and unengaged external spectator, is aging and changing along with the people. The observer and the observed are wearing the same watches. It is not always easy to distinguish between what has actually changed in the observable empirical world on the one hand, and on the other, the dissimilar perceptions held by a naive, wet behind the ears recent college graduate versus a recently retired professor. Both the Nepalis I have known over the years and I are not only a little older, but maybe even a little wiser, although whether my wisdom has kept pace with theirs is another matter too. But young or old, since those early days I have observed and sometimes participated in change in a variety of venues through involvement in long-term, in-depth experience and study of a small number of small places, as is the anthropologist's wont. It's not so much that anthropologists study small places, usually villages, as that they study in villages, where they examine the same things that other scholars study in other places, whether large, such as nations, or small, such as individual human beings, or even places where there are no real flesh and blood living people, as in literature. That is, we anthropologists study things like humor, honor, ambition, bravery, fear, loathing, and death. I want to mention 3 separate instances of changing dynamics, which at first glance seem utterly unconnected. The first is the Sherpas of Solukhumbu, now famous around the world for their strength, stamina, mountaineering skills, and of course for Tenzing Norgay's achievement of climbing Mount Everest in 1953. I first went to Solukhumbu in 1964 and continued to visit there off and on for 40 years. Of all the many ethnic groups in Nepal, they are least in need of an introduction. The second is the farming and trading Kaiki-speaking Muggers of Dolpa, who are, by contrast, not famous even in Nepal, and about whom many of you will never have heard. I spent an uninterrupted year with them in 1968 and 1969, mostly in the village of Sahartara, which, with a population of 365, was the largest village at that time in Dolpa. I returned to Dolpa after a lapse of 42 years in March and April of this year. And the third example is an influential political figure, Tanka Prasad Acharya, with whom, along with his wife, Rewanta Kumari, I held extended conversations in the late 1980s and early 90s about the beginnings of democracy in Nepal and his role in founding the first democratic political party in the country, which led a revolt against the Ranas. Indeed, these 3 spheres are unconnected in almost every way imaginable. And I sometimes wonder how I ended up in such different parts of the country with such different kinds of people following such different ways of life. The prospect of speaking to you this afternoon gave me pause. It made me realize the time had come to talk about what I had been doing, in addition to what I thought I had been doing in those places all this time. As a result, I hope to show that, despite all their multiple differences, they share 2 analytical commonalities. One is that they all are, or were in the case of Tanka Prasad, undergoing the process of globalization, but an aspect of globalization not normally recognized as such, and discussed even less. The second commonality is seen through an emphasis on what in anthropological jargon is sometimes called practice, a term as obscure as globalization is common, and which I will try to clarify momentarily, but which for the moment we can take as the idea that human behavior is generated more by the things that we actually do than the beliefs that we hold. Since all this happens on a more or less unconscious level, this entails the ancillary proposition that since we do not know what we are doing, what we do has more meaning than we know. The rest of my remarks will attempt to expand on these 2 portentous notions. Let me start with globalization, a word first coined as recently as 1950, but which has achieved such common currency that one can hardly avoid it now in any newspaper, magazine, TV program, or even internet blog. It is a word which sounds as if its meaning should be obvious and transparent, but which becomes harder to pin down the more closely one examines it. What does it ultimately amount to, globalization? At its conceptual core, it might be defined as the expansion and intensification of social relations and consciousness across time and space, which, while time and space themselves are dramatically compressed. Or, more briefly still, it may be thought of as a long-term but accelerating historical process of growing worldwide interconnectedness. Of course, broadly understood, globalization is not a recent process at all. It has been underway for a very long time, as long as human populations have been moving from place to place, whether across a river, a mountain range, or an ocean. transporting ideas and ideologies, including religions, along with the material goods they carry with them. Certainly one might argue, in the Nepali and American cases, that globalization has been a fundamental part of their national histories, with unending successive waves of immigrants from all directions, beginning hundreds and even thousands of years ago. These population movements constitute a double-edged demographic sword. They have both contributed to and helped resolve many of the problems these two nations face today. Not only is globalization old as a social and demographic phenomenon, but even the antiquity of its self-conscious genealogy is old, as seen in the reply Diogenes, the 3rd century philosopher, made when anyone asked him where he came from. His answer was always, "I am a citizen of the world." However, today I focus only on recent stages in the growth of that globalization, changes that dramatically altered its pace, scope, depth, and character as the last half of the 20th century came to a close and the 21st century began. I do so in a very limited and small-scale way, again, the anthropologist's predilection. Yet what at first glance might seem to be minor developments, hardly worth mentioning, may in the long run decide the shape of events that ultimately carry the day. Definitions notwithstanding, unlike other isation words, that is, words such as industrialization, urbanization, westernization, modernization, and even the popular derivative term development, all of them terms that seduced the post-World War II generation, globalization remains a vague and elusive concept, even as it is largely displacing those isation words. Therefore, I suggest that what the term globalization needs to flesh out its substance is not more bloodless abstractions of the kind I just quoted, or an analysis of world systems theory of the sort espoused by Wallerstein, but real-life examples capable of breathing shape, color, and sound into it. This is easier said than done, however, because although the effects of globalization are, like those of culture, powerful, the people doing the globalizing, or being globalized, are, again, as in the case of culture, not necessarily aware of them. If I may briefly jump ahead of my 3 examples, this was certainly the case with the first batch of Peace Corps volunteers to Nepal in 1962, when a small group of 70 people, previously unknown to each other, exemplified the expansion and intensification of worldwide interconnectedness by being caught up in the sudden globalizing pulse that dramatically interrupted their everyday lives. Americans, some of whom had barely been off the farms they grew up on or had never flown in an airplane, suddenly dropped out of the sky into Nepal. Whatever effects they may have had or not had on Nepal, during their 2 years in Nepal, they encountered conditions which were utterly and entirely new to them, along a variety of dimensions: religious, Hindu and Buddhist; familial, joint family; political, absolute monarchy; educational, rote memorization; and dietary, dalabat. These dimensions of existence globalized them profoundly, although they didn't think of it that way. Whatever occupation or life they followed in the next 50 years, Nepal remained a formative and ineradicable part of their lives. Inexorably bonded to it, they were unalterably transfigured and transformed by their intensified connection to it. That itself is only of anecdotal significance. What makes it important for globalization is that they then returned to the US, where, already globalized by Nepal, they spent the rest of their lives globalizing the American communities they lived in by explaining and illustrating the facts of life in Nepal as they saw them, and probably progressively exaggerating them, through nothing other than being part of the institutional routines of everyday American life, schools, churches, civic organizations, jobs, and the like. As a result, although most Americans would still have trouble locating Nepal on a map, few would now mistake Nepal for Naples, as many of those Peace Corpsmen did when they first learned of their assignment 50 years ago. This is part of the story of how American society began to experience seismic changes about a half-century ago in politics, gender, race, and profession, aided and abetted by a new wave of unprecedented voluntary peace activism. The identities of individual volunteers and the Nepalis who got to know them were challenged, forged, and altered. What has happened to them, to Nepal, to the United States, and to the world since then is as much a part of globalization as currency exchange rates. The subject-object dichotomy disappeared because we were wearing the same watches. These developments have been part of a transformation of American society and Nepali society to the limited extent that I, as a queer anthropologist, can understand it. It's true that all this involved basically the people of only two nations, but to beat a conceptual retreat by calling it nothing other than an instance of internationalization and asserting that the world consists of just a couple hundred nation states ignores some fundamental realities about how the supposedly international world works. The trouble with the internationalization stance is that it ignores the existence of large and influential but non-national organizations such as Exxon, which has a larger economy than that of New Zealand. Globalization is alert to what internationalization overlooks. That is one of the problems with conceptualizing globalization, the assumption that it is mostly about economics. Indeed, economists have successfully hijacked the term, as they often do. After all, it is an ill wind that blows no economist good. What needs to be emphasized, by contrast, is that globalization involves more than $4 trillion worth of currencies being transacted every day, because globalization is also a human phenomenon, as illustrated by such facts as that at any given time, 5 lakhs of people are sitting on airplanes. Now that may be an important economic fact for the airline industry, but it's also important for those 5 lakhs of people who may be flying to new places, having new conversations, new experiences, which cause them to see the world and their place in it in a new way. Globalization is social and cultural, but it is more than that. It is also experienced by individuals grappling with it one at a time. My argument rests on the assumption that Peace Corps volunteers can be seen as data points in the continuing paradigmatic shift that altered the United States and Nepal during these roughly 50 years. One might object that 70 volunteers in a country of 11 million people, population of Nepal at that time, could not make any impact worth thinking about. But first of all, this ignores the fact that over a period of 2 years, each volunteer interacts with hundreds of Nepalis. And secondly, that their relations, some of which are conducted in the fractured Nepali of the volunteers, are often personal and of some depth. But to return to sheer numbers, what about 3,000 volunteers, which is the number who had served by the end of the tenure of the Peace Corps in Nepal in 2004? Or of the many more thousands of volunteers from other nations such as Japan, UK, Germany, or Denmark who came to Nepal, or the 1 lakh or so NGOs in Nepal, many of which, at various levels of involvement, comprise still more examples of ongoing globalization. Or 2 lakhs of people, which is the number of Peace Corps volunteers who have served in some 139 countries over the last 50 years, or all those from many countries who have worked in such multinational organizations as Crossroads Africa, or Doctors Without Borders, or Wildlife Conservation Society. Globalization, in this more comprehensive social sense of the term, is everywhere, even if we do not count the 880 million international tourists who travel every year. Therefore, I want to proceed along the lines of Giddens' argument that globalization is not only about what is out there, remote and far away from the individual, it is an in-here phenomenon too, influencing intimate and personal aspects of our lives. Some might argue that globalization is just a taken for granted context, macro context, too abstract and unwieldy for anthropologists to handle. But if that objection can be challenged by investigating Wall Street investment bankers ethnographically, as has been done, then Peace Corps volunteers and citizens of Nepal can certainly also serve as grist for the globalization mill. Looking at globalization as it plays out in these kinds of organizations this way contextualizes it, localizes it, and grounds it in the lives of real people living in real time and real space. Working on a smaller canvas like this results in a picture featuring more vivid contrasts and sharper detail than can be seen in the vast but impersonal panorama of capital and labor transfers. Framing the picture in this way allows us to interpret the picture at its own indigenous level rather than prescribing from far and above how the picture should be drawn. Unlike the artist, the actors, such as Peace Corps volunteers and Nepali citizens, had no idea that they were stock players in a worldwide tableau. As a vernacular buzzword, the term globalization means different things to different people. Ironically, for a neologism, it is multi-referential, part corporate hype, part capitalist regulatory agenda, part cultural excitement, part social commentary and protest. In the 19th century and for the first half of the 20th century, globalization in America was considered positively, a chance to bring literacy and civilization, and often Christianity, to the rest of the world, which was in turn a huge untapped market for American capitalists and a source of much needed labor to build railroads, develop industry, and farm the land in America. Nowadays, by contrast, the general American public sees globalization as the beleaguering force behind such painful and unpleasant developments as sweatshops, outsourcing, out-of-control immigration, and worldwide upheavals involving institutes such as banks and financial markets. Nepal, forced by poverty to engage in some of these activities, usually ends up on the short end of the globalizing stick, but not always, as I try to explain next. Specifically, I now examine globalization as it has been illustrated and played out in 3 Nepali instances. Thus, I concentrate on how one small piece fits into the larger and historical globalizing puzzle, rather than dwell further on the meta-notions on which the notion of globalization is supposed to be constructed. There are already enough polemics and profundities surrounding these ideas in the world. The Nepali cases are instructive because while they are externally so different from each other, they nevertheless share the phenomenon of being subject, one way or the other, to the pervasive and relentless impact of globalization. When I first visited the Sherpas in 1964, I had to start walking from Banipal. 14 days later, I reached Namche Bazaar. Solukhumbu Sherpas had been globalized for a century or more by migrating to Darjeeling in search of mountaineering and other kinds of employment, and nearly 500 years before that by migrating from eastern Tibet into Nepal. But life in Khumbu itself continued pretty much as it always had. I recorded 6 foreign tourists in Khumbu during all of 1964, not counting members of Sir Edmund Hillary's expedition, of which I was a part. That compares with the 30,000 who visit Solukhumbu annually now. What were Sir Edmund and the rest of us up to? What we thought we were doing by building a little dirt airstrip on patches of uncultivated jungle and a few steep potato fields at a tiny hamlet called Lukla was providing a way to service the medical clinic scheduled for construction in Khumbu a couple of years later. What we actually were doing was very different. We were providing a facility that would soon funnel tourists in enormous numbers into Khumbu as travel time was reduced from 2 weeks to 40 minutes. Although it seems implausibly naive in retrospect, the thought that tourists would want to fly into our little airstrip so that they could see Mount Everest never occurred to us. We were blissfully unaware, in true globalizing fashion, of what we were doing. What had been a scattered settlement of 6 or 8 small farmhouses was transformed into a boomtown. An asphalt runway eventually replaced the dirt airstrip, and, I suppose inevitably, a VIP lounge provided the eventual finishing touch. In the wake of the airstrip, all up and down the Dudkosi Valley, from Lukla to Everest Base Camp, there arose an efflorescence of first lodges, tea houses, and hotels, to be followed a little later by pizza parlors, laundromats, and internet facilities. The time and space compression which accompanies modernization, globalization, has been almost total. But in the characteristic way globalizing works, I didn't notice the even more profound ramifications of our projects. That is, the effects of the schools we were also building in Sherpa villages. As with tourism, the rest of the world became a part of the Sherpa villages, but this time via education and with fundamental consequences, such as literacy in the Nepali language for integration into the nation, knowledge of the English language for integration into the rest of the world, study of all the standard subjects, such as mathematics, science, geography, history, and so on, which produced a modern worldview. But globalization is no more simply a modernizing or westernizing affair than it is a homogenizing one. Globalization must be read instead as a complex process that brings the West to the rest and the rest to the West. It must be understood, in short, as a process of mutual imbrication. In the Sherpa case, the process was demonstrably not one way. Trekkers were gripped by the Sherpa lifestyle, and especially the religion. And nearly as many Sherpas have traveled to the rest of the world as foreigners have come to Khumbu. There are now more than 5,000 Sherpas in New York City alone. The West and the rest met and globalized each other in Khumbu. Neither would be the same again. Both different from what they had been, but also different from each other. Most important for its long-term impact on Sherpa life, through education, Sherpas were able to take command of their own economy and therefore of their own destiny. Instead of serving as high-altitude mules for non-Sherpas, usually high-caste owners of trekking agencies, Sherpas founded, owned, and operated many of the tourist companies which would otherwise have exploited them. As a consequence, many Sherpas now own upscale houses in Kathmandu in addition to their homes in Khumbu, and live in one or the other according to the season, agricultural as well as trekking and mountaineering. At first glance, the people of Dolpa seem very similar to the Sherpas. Northern border residents, Tibeto-Burman speaking, Buddhist, agricultural trading community, remote. As was the case with Khumbu, my first trip to the Tichurong Valley in Dolpa in 1968 was a 2-week trek, starting from the trailhead in Pokhara, which itself could only be reached by air in those days. As in Khumbu, an airstrip subsequently built in Dolpa cut that travel time from 2 weeks to 40 minutes. A major difference, however, is that Dolpa people do not live at the bottom of Mount Everest. To this day, relatively few tourists are attracted there. But in a more modest way, Tichurong has been globalizing and globalized for many decades and probably centuries. They have traditionally traded their millet and buckwheat for rock salt from Tibet, which they then exchanged for rice and manufactured goods in the lower hills of Nepal. Just as they transported goods between contrasting ecological zones, they also were in the middle culturally between the northern Buddhist, Tibetan-speaking Botes and the southern Hindu, Nepali speakers, populations which generally didn't know each other's languages and did not travel to each other's territories. Hence the critical role of the interstitial muggers, who spoke both languages and traveled to both areas. For good measure, and as a way of making their ethnic diversity even more complicated than it would have otherwise already been, they threw into the mix their own distinctive language, Kaiki, spoken by about 1,000 people in only 3 villages in the world. As village schools arrived in Tichurong, much more slowly and less well equipped than they are in Khumbu, increased mobility for Dopalis has been slower to develop. But gradually more education has enabled some Tichurong villagers to begin to expand into larger, more lucrative parts of the national and world economy. Alongside the traditional trade in salt, grain, and small-scale manufactured goods like cloth, cigarettes, and tennis shoes, a few entrepreneurs have entered the world of Tibetan carpet manufacturing in the Kathmandu Valley. In doing so, they, or rather their children, also begin to lose their Kaiki language, but retain cultural strength in other ways by residing near each other in the Bodhnat area and renting meeting halls where they celebrate Tichurong holidays communally. In very recent years, they have been well positioned to harvest Yarsagumba, summer plant, winter insect, is the literal Tibetan translation, from the high pass located just 3 hours above their villages. This crop, regarded by the Chinese as a potent aphrodisiac, sometimes referred to in English as organic Viagra, is vastly more lucrative than they could have dreamt of previously. In a month or two, a family might gather enough Yarsagumba, 1 or 2 kilograms, to earn 2 or 3 lakhs of rupees, cash income far in excess of what they could have earned before. Even more than with their traditional trans-Himalayan trading and investments in Tibetan carpet manufacturing, the Yarsagumba trade takes them very far afield, in a few cases to destinations as distant as Hong Kong, China, and Singapore. All this is activity by people whose movements have been largely restricted, until very recently, to within the borders of Nepal, although the goods they trafficked in, the economic side of globalization, came ultimately from Tibet and India. People whose social life outside their villages had not gone beyond entering a tea shop on a dusty trail in western Nepal now march self-confidently into the Hyatt Regency. These changes have come mostly at a slow pace. The Dopalis are obviously aware of their new opportunities and take advantage of them as aggressively as they can. But the opportunities come gradually enough that they all seem to be a part of the natural order of things. That they are made possible by vast changes in technology and an encroaching and globalizing world is not fully comprehended. Even the very recent introduction of cell phones to Tichurong, which has reduced the time needed to transmit a message to or from the United States from 2 months to 2 seconds, is already considered routine and unremarkable. Luddite that I am, I relied on their technological expertise to execute commands on my own cell phone. In the kinds of transformations I've been describing, people act as part of large-scale systemic globalization processes, whether they know it or not. Just as in the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna finds himself impelled to fight without knowing the larger context of the battles in which he fights. But sometimes an individual, by being in the right place at the right time, gets caught up in unpredictable but dramatic life-changing ways. This was the case with the cantankerous old Dopali who played the elderly village leader in the film Caravan. Since I ran into him several times in Dopa, I could see that in the film he simply played himself. Bigger than life, and magnified many times on the big screen. Once upon a time a village leader, he became known around the world for playing the same role he had been playing all along in Dopa. The film is even more globalized and globalizing in that its director was a Frenchman, and the film was eventually nominated for an Oscar in Hollywood. Globalization in the case of Tanka Prasad was also of an obviously more individual type. and he too assumed the role of a star, although a political one. Tonka Prasad's initial encounter with globalization followed his learning of English as a child and his subsequent discovery of the great liberal political tradition of the West in the works of such thinkers as Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Karl Marx, Lenin, Voltaire, Rousseau, Napoleon, H.G. Wells, and Bernard Shaw. Their ideas excited his imagination beyond anything he had theretofore read of in Nepali language books available in the 1930s, or had heard about from his parents in his traditional Brahmanical household. These books transformed his perception of political realities in Nepal and his life. Afterwards, as in the cases of the Sherpas and Gopalis, there was no turning back. As a consequence, instead of following in the stiff footsteps of his father and pursuing the humdrum life of a mid-level civil servant under the Ranas, he chose the career of a political revolutionary, founding the first democratic political party in Nepal, which ultimately landed him a lifetime jail sentence at the hands of the Ranas. Much as the Ranas would have liked to execute him, they just could not bring themselves to incur all the sin of pap that, as devout Hindus, killing a Brahmin would entail. As consolation, they had to satisfy themselves with executing his friends, the four martyrs. After 10 grim years in the Kathmandu Central Jail, Tonka Prasad was released when the Rana regime was finally overthrown, and he eventually became prime minister in 1955 in a democratic government, a position he had first learned about from his readings in English political history. As prime minister, he had the rare opportunity to globalize his country in a spectacular and unprecedented literal way by opening diplomatic relations with China, the Soviet Union, Japan, Egypt, and Switzerland. Thus, in varying ways, these three examples show how globalization works, not only at the global economic level, but at the social, cultural, political, and even personal levels. It is a process in which neither regional state histories nor particularistic ethnographic identities go far enough, because globalization transcends them. Just as biology can tell us that leaves fall in the autumn, but not exactly when any particular leaf will fall, globalization cannot predict exactly which people will be mobilized and maneuvered out of their comfort zones. But that does not gainsay it as a ubiquitous force which can be neither denied nor escaped. All these cases assume the epistemological position that only insofar as one does things is it possible to know about things. But no one proceeds from a blank slate. Tonka Prasad's knowledge of Western political philosophy preceded his own political activity, both of which formed a feedback loop that deepened his prior book knowledge. What matters, ultimately, is the ways in which globalization can be grasped and turned to one's advantage, rather than otherwise, whether individually, culturally, or nationally. But the familiar and unavoidable macro-micro question, which plagues all of social science, remains. That is, how does the unfathomably vast and impersonal force of globalization become translated into the routines of everyday events in Nepal? Compression of time and space is one thing. The rhythm of a 24-hour day and location at a specific longitude and latitude and altitude is another. What is the mechanism by which individual human beings confront and manipulate the globalizing changes they meet head on, or try to, whether they are aware of them or not? The standard anthropological answer is that globalization operates the same way any other such set of influences operates, that is, culturally. Since human beings are primarily cultural beings, it should just be a matter of identifying the culture, which anthropologists are supposed to be good at, composed of sets of symbols and meanings which guide the behaviors of people sharing a common lifestyle. A conventional way to do that is to operationalize culture as a set of rules which constrain or encourage people to behave one way or another. They apply to any domain of life, marriage, religion, or economy, for example. Instances are not hard to find. There is a wide variety of marriage practices in Nepal. Some groups practice matrilateral cross-cousin marriage. Communal religious rituals are found in many places, sometimes in the form of a community religious system in which households hold annual feasts by turn. It is well known that division of labor may follow along class, caste, ethnic, or gender lines. Defining culture by rules, or deriving it from them, has the advantage of being explicit. However, it also has the unintentional effect of construing individual human beings as cultural zombies, mindlessly following rules handed down to them, whereas in real life, culture is not only structured, but also restructured by actors over generations. Changes over these generations cannot be accounted for by a listing of rules for any one generation. Furthermore, mere knowledge of rules is not necessarily the most critical tool to use in negotiating one's way through the obstacles that life puts in our way. This can be illustrated in various domains. One can easily imagine someone mastering all the official rules governing football matches, yet still being an indifferent player. By contrast, what the great football player requires, much more than a knowledge of intricate rules, is a feel for the game, a sense he can get only by playing it. Thus, it is more true to say that people do not so much follow rules as improvise on the spot, not randomly, but within boundaries which culture sets, according to the demands that they confront in the practice of whatever game of life they are playing. Such improvisation results in strategies which are, like the globalization that helps generate them, unconscious. In the case of the matrilateral cross-cousin marriage rule practiced in Dolpa, what if the mother's brother's daughter is not the right age? What if the mother's brother doesn't have a daughter? Or worse still, what if the mother doesn't have a brother? Do these states of affairs preclude the possibility of marriage because they violate beliefs and rules about how marriage should be executed? Of course not. What people do in these cases is improvise. They find a classificatory mother's brother if there isn't a real one, or an unrelated bride if there are no classificatory relatives available. If a rule is impossible to follow because what one has to do to obey it is too difficult or impossible, one has to manipulate it or find a way around it according to whatever opportunities present themselves. Opportunities that are under the most stable conditions inexorably changing, and certainly changing under the pressure and presence of globalization. Similarly, if a family's turn has come to host an annual village feast, as with the Sherpa case of celebrating the Dumje festival, and if they skip town, someone else will fill in, and whoever reneges on their obligation will eventually face the consequences. What one does or doesn't do becomes paramount, regardless of belief. Or, if only men do the plowing, as in Dolpa, because plowing causes pain to the bullock, which is a sin, and women and lamas should not sin, and if there are no men available in a particular household for plowing, swaps with other households will be made. What is essential is that the plowing be done, and it emphatically will be done, by devising and invoking new rules if need be. Among the muggers of Tichurong, as noted above, men do all the plowing and trading, while women do most domestic chores and all the agricultural work except for plowing. If a man lacks helpers on his trading trips, his wife might help out if she doesn't have small children at home to care for. In the Sherpa case, Buddhist monks are generally celibate. But if they are not, and even reincarnate lamas are sometimes stray, such an errant monk might leave the monastery and start a family. Sherpas recognize quite explicitly that monastic vows cannot always be kept. If they are not kept, they might regret it, but there is always wiggle room around them. The point is not that improvisation is preferred to following norms or rules as a rational strategy. The point is that in real life, improvisation is the only thing that works. Tonka Prasad's wife observed a traditional Brahmin diet. No tomatoes or onions or garlic, not to mention chicken or eggs. But when Tonka Prasad was serving his life prison term, she began to meet wives of other imprisoned politicians who not only observed more liberal diets, but who were also annoyed by her insistence that she cook all her own food. So she said to herself, well, my husband is in jail and eating forbidden foods and enjoying new commensal rules, and I want to eat too. So she began thinking about examples of intercaste dining in the Mahabharata and also in the Ramayana, when Ram happily ate food prepared by a low-caste woman. Sriwanta Kumari gradually realized there were alternative rules, seemingly at odds with those by which she had always lived, but for which, nonetheless, a case could be made about what she could or could not eat. She changed her diet accordingly. Similarly, the Ranas outcasted Tonka Prasad in prison by shaving his head, including his tupi, or topknot. This was the most serious punishment they could give him, short of execution, aside from life imprisonment. When Tonka Prasad was finally released from jail, his wife's family wanted to invite him for dinner, but according to caste rules, could not do so because, being outcasted, Tonka Prasad was no longer a Brahmin. Even Sriwanta Kumari was tainted by her association with him. But her family also had to face the reality that this commensal rule conflicted with the more general rule that it would be a violation of social logic and sheer human decency for them not to eat with their son-in-law, who had suffered so much for his country and for which he was nicknamed the living martyr, just because of a caste rule which he had had no role in breaking. So they broke the dietary caste rule, requiring commensal relations only with other Brahmins, and went ahead with their dinner date with Tonka Prasad. A political example more relevant in today's conditions is Tonka Prasad's actions on behalf of what in those days were called, in English, untouchables. As a political radical espousing social equality, he could not countenance the deprivation and prejudice against the low-ranked artisan castes stipulated in the Molki Ain. In the early 1950s, therefore, he put his money where his mouth was and led a procession of untouchables into Pashupatinath. This movement met with strong opposition, but he was unyielding and insisted that it had to be done. As a result, 50 years later, the rules have changed, and no one thinks twice about the elites going into temples. After this social and religious rebellion was over, he went to King Tribhuvan and told him that he should appoint untouchables to his cabinet. King Tribhuvan replied, half humorously, that Tonka Prasad already represented the untouchables, so why was there a need of anyone else to do so? Tonka Prasad did not view his actions as abandoning Hinduism or even reforming it. Besides being a professed Hindu, reading the great epics, praying and performing occasional puja, he had little interest in the technical details of its philosophy or theology. He simply held a very different notion of what the human essentials of Hinduism required, usually expressed in terms of tolerance and hospitality. Whatever his notion of Hinduism was, it had no place for such blatant injustice as untouchability. By improvising in all these ways, doing whatever it is that they do, people assert their own agency and little by little create their own culture, which differs from that which they have inherited from their predecessors. We are not being hypocritical in improvising in this way, nor even inconsistent, just creative and adaptive. We should not forget Aldous Huxley's aphorism that the only completely consistent people are the dead. If it were not the case that improvisation is unavoidable, cultures would never change, whereas they always do change. Slowly in isolated traditional societies, rapidly in cases where globalization is operating. All this is not to say that people never obey rules, or don't try to obey them, or wish they could obey them, nor is it to denigrate the role of ideology, which may be seen as an elaborate network of rules and sub-rules produced by an endless series of improvisations. But it is to say that rules can be stretched or thrown out altogether, and new rules made for new games, as happens after revolutions, and new cultures created, and new individual behaviors fashioned according to the needs of the time and place by means of an implicit practical logic. People follow religious and social rules when they can, bending them as necessary when they need to, which results in new rules. Ideologies are always the final outcome of these pressures, including the political ideologies swirling around us constantly, and which are both causes and effects of the political improvisations we constantly practice. Everyone does this. It is not a matter of education or literacy or personality or even culture. It is the way human beings live, contesting the incoherent spots in their culture, nibbling at the edges of them, pushing them in new directions where they can. It is the way we fashion and refashion, within historical limits, the structures that are so familiar to us and which come to seem so natural that they become, as we say, part of our culture. Culture results from this connection between agency and structure, just as the river, carving new channels within its banks, is connected to the structural lake into which it flows before it is emptied by yet another river. There are many forces at work in crafting the logic of practice, by which logic norms in society are executed or not. But certainly globalization is one of those forces. It operates at many levels, economic, social, cultural, individual, and in many guises. And it comes from all directions, at us, from us, through us. It is everywhere, not just out there somewhere in the economic stratosphere, but in here too, inside our minds and hearts, and the goals and ambitions, or ideologies if you prefer, by which we live. Anthropological views of human agency all too frequently and uncritically resemble that of the hero of Camus' novel, A Stranger, who at the end of the book says that in the long run, one gets used to anything. The reactions we have seen in the Sherpa villages of Khumbu, in the Kaiki-speaking villages of Dopo, and in the urban lives of high-caste, middle-class, left-leaning political activists and leaders show how people do not get used to anything, no matter what the circumstances. Instead, they react creatively and productively to move themselves and their cultures in novel and hitherto unexplored directions. Different groups, of which Nepal certainly has no shortage, find themselves in very different situations economically, socially, and so on, and therefore have different ideas about how to do this, which generates political opposition among the groups. But they all follow a logic based on what they do as much as on what they believe. They do so under the influence of globalization, the primary engine driving not just change or dynamics in the examples which I discussed during this lecture, but changing dynamics, the process by which change itself is changing. मेरो आजको प्रेजेन्टेसन सिधाएँ। यो लामो लेक्चर धारे यात्रा पूर्वक सुनिदिनु भएकोमा म तपाईहरू सबैलाई धन्यवाद दिन्छु।
Thank you, Professor Fisher. I will certainly not try to summarize what you've just said. It is neither our custom nor does your lecture lend itself so easily to another interpretation. But I would like to thank you all for your presence here and making the 2011 Mahesh Chandra Regmi lecture a success once again. A special thanks goes to Professor Fisher for accepting our invitation and providing us with ideas to mull over in the days to come. I now request all of you to join us for high tea upstairs at Darbar Hall. And as you leave the hall, please pick up a copy of the lecture. Thank you very much.